Before we start this video, a large thank you to Luke, Neo, Floyd, Jesse, and Gage for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And an immense thank you to Halo Burner for their continued support of the channel this month on Patreon. As always, it is greatly and sincerely appreciated, my friend, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, and today we're going to add in the architecture or framework for our spell system. So let's go into the scripts and items folder. Let's create a new C# script, and I'm just going to call this spellitem. So this will be the base class for all spells, and all spells will derive from this class. Let's open up Visual Studios and delete the start and update functionality and add in a namespace as is per tradition. Also, apologies if you hear any background noise. My dogs are around me right now. So I'm going to make this derive from the item class, so we get all of the item variables like the icon, the item name, etc., etc. I'm going to make a public void attempt to cast spell. So let's actually just write out all of the functions that we're going to use right now for this framework, and then we'll start adding some comments as to what they do, and I'll explain myself. So right below attempt to cast spell, I'm going to make this require a player manager variable, by the way. All of these will. I'm going to have successfully cast spell, and I'm going to call player manager player, and then right below that again, I'm going to add these two comments first. This is where you attempt to play the spell, so you play a warm-up animation. And this is where you play the casting, so the end part of the animation, if you successfully get through the warm-up part. Because if you get hit or knocked out of the warm-up part, you will not play the rest of the spell. So I'm going to make a private void for instantiate warm-up spell effects that will most likely change from a private to a public, but for now, we're just going to keep that as a private. And then we're going to have instantiate spell release effects. So the warm-up effects is like, let's say we're going to use fireball, for example. If you have a fireball conjured in your hand, then the warm-up effect is the fireball, maybe the sparks that pop off. And the release effect is the actual projectile that will spawn when you throw it. Lastly, let's make a function for can I use this item, and we're just going to check with this before we attempt to cast, see if we can even actually perform the cast. So I'm going to make all these virtual voids, so the privates will now become protected, but I still think we're going to make those public depending on what route we take. I'll describe the two possibilities. You might use the other route where you don't need to. Let's make these protected for now, though. Okay, looks good. Alright, cool. So we have our comments, we have our framework here in terms of our functionality. What is next? Well, you start adding some variables. Let's go up top here and make a header. And I'm going to call this header spell modifiers. And right now there's only just the one. This is the full charge modifier, which we won't implement in this episode, but we're going to implement it. Basically, some spells can be charged, and if you charge them to their fullest potential, it will basically increase the effectiveness of the spell, whether that be damage or, say, healing effects in terms of a healing spell. Now right below that, we can also put down the spell slots used for each spell. So some spell slots, I believe they're called memory slots, in Elden Ring will use 2, others will use 1. Right below that, let's have spell effects as a header, and then I'm going to put a few variables here for the warm-up effects and the spell release effects. Just a note, if it doesn't make sense to you that spell release effects is like the actual spell projectile, you can rename that to spell projectile, but I like using release effects because not all spells are projectiles. Like healing spells, for example, the release effect is like the healing sphere that will come up under you. So I just like using the keyword there, release, for that reason. And now you can also have effects for the full charge version, which I'll put as a to-do. We won't do that right now in this video. Let's just get the framework done first, and we can add on to it after it's all in there. So lastly, we're going to need animations down here as well. Let's make a header for that. I'm just going to comment out the full charge effect multiplier until we get around to doing it, just so we're not overloaded with information here. Now for animations, we're going to have the startup animation. So we have two versions of this. One is in the main hand and one is in the off hand if you're doing it just like Elden Ring, because you can cast spells from either hand depending on where your catalyst is equipped. So I'm going to use main hand and off hand spell animations. Also, if you are a Patreon, I will link the animations I use in this video down below. Both main hand and off hand spell versions. Eventually they'll probably be available in a pack or in one of the packs on our asset store, but if you are a Patreon, they will be available in the description of this video right now. So lastly too, we can add some sound effects. We won't actually add these in this video. We're just going to get the framework done first, but every spell will most likely have a release sound effect and a warm-up sound effect, so you can put those there as well. And that pretty much covers most, if not all, of the general stuff that spells will have. So now we can actually get around to making a practice spell, setting up how spells are equipped in our inventory, and basically syncing their status across the network. So let's start by making a folder here under items in scripts and drag in our spells. We'll call the folder spells. Then we can go inside that folder and we can create a new spell. I'm just going to call it test spell. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I just want, like our test action in the past, to verify that the framework is going to be working as intended, and it's going to go through all the hoops we needed to go through to actually cast a spell. So let's make this derive from spell item, like so. And then we can basically just override some of the logic here and throw some debug messages and make sure that we're actually going through things as need be. Let's also create an asset menu so we can actually make this as a scriptable object in our project, like an item. So the menu name will be items/spells/test spell. Let's save that. I'm going to go back into the project now. I'm going to go to data, items, create a new folder for, you guessed it, spells. And then I'll create our new scriptable object spell in here. Now, remember, because of how we fetch our items, if this item is not in our item database, you most likely won't be able to use it unless you've altered the code in some way. You won't be able to use it on your character or actually even have it appear in the game. So let's go and make a new list of items here under the World Item database. Let's call this spells, and let's just copy Ashes of War and change Ashes of War to spells, and change the list type from Ash of War to spell item. And then you can copy any of these functions we use to fetch these things from the database, as we've done before, and just change the variable type to a spell item, and just change the keyword to spells, referencing the spells list. So I'm just going to copy Ash of War, get Ash of War by ID, change it to public spell item, and I'm going to say get spell item, or just get spell actually by ID. And we're going to reference the spells dot first or default, and then everything else is the same, and we're good to go. Now let's not forget to actually add these two to the totality item list, or the totality of all items in the item list, so it gets an ID. We're going to do that by making a for each here and referencing every item inside the spells. And then we're going to say items, as in the list of all items, add each item from the spells. Okay, cool. Now we just need to add our spell to that list when we save. So I'm going to save now. I'm going to go back to the project. I'm going to go to the player inventory manager. We're going to make a variable here for the current spell we have equipped. So we'll get around to doing the indexing and selecting through multiple spells later on, but right now, let's make sure we can have a spell equipped, and let's make sure that it's going to cast correctly. So after we do that, let's go to the player network manager and give this a variable using its ID, much like we do with our weapons. So we just need a variable to reference this so that when this variable changes, we can change the spell locally on everybody who's connected. So basically, you always have the right spell to match up with your network ID for that spell. So then we can copy one of these on current right weapon or left weapon changed functions, change it to on current spell ID changed. Then we have a spell item. We can rename new weapon to new spell. And we can go to the world item database and we can go get spell by ID. Alright, cool. Now we can reference the player.player inventory manager current spell is equal to new spell. Then we could say, or delete rather, everything else here. And we need to call this now on network spawn. So we got to subscribe to this event. Whether you're the owner of the player object or not, this needs to be called. So you would do it outside of the if is owner check. So I'm going to put it right below where we have the weapon IDs changing, because it's just like that really. It's just when you're changing the ID of this, it's going to update the new spell in your inventory. So player network manager current spell ID dot on value changed plus equals player network manager dot on current spell ID changed. Let's also unsubscribe from that event on the on network despawn. And let's also make sure we call that when we're loading players into a game where we join that's already active. And by that I mean if you join a game that's already happening, there's 2 players in there, then the value is never changed, so you're never updating the spell. So to do this, we're just going to call that on value change function as soon as we join for every other player who's already in the game. So down here on load other players characters when joining server, let's just put it right below sync weapons. It's very similar. You can see we're already doing the same thing. So on current right weapon change, and we're just passing the current version of the network variable. We'll do the same thing with the spell by saying player network manager on current spell ID changed. And then you can just pass 0 and then pass the current spell ID. So that will be the player network manager dot current spell ID dot value. Okay, cool. Looks good. Let's save that. Okay, let's jump over these images here for a second. So we have here ways to sync spellcasting on the network. And I'm going to give you 2 very straightforward ways that I think are best for the situation. And I will tell you which one I chose for my project and why I think it is the best. So the first option is animation events. So method 1, animation events. Since we play our actions in sync via server RPCs, by that I mean every time we play an animation, the owner of the character playing the animation sends out a server RPC so that you play that same animation on your character model on everybody else's game. So because of this, if we attach animation events to each animation, then basically we'll always play these spell actions as long as the animations play out, so the animations are doing the work for us. Now the pros of this is it's very easy to use. It's less information being passed across the network because you don't got to sync, say like instantiating a network object and then syncing the position of it every frame, and then whatever else goes into that. Also, the projectiles will never appear to lag because they're moving locally and they're not having the network position updated. This means that if someone has a bit of latency and they're having stutters or issues in their connection, you won't see the projectile stutter because the projectile is being instantiated on both versions of the game, you and your friends, locally, and the movement is happening locally within your version of the game. So the cons are, if the caster begins to lag just before casting, let's say on his screen he casts, but there's a delay when he sends out the server RPC to play the network animation, then he'll cast on his screen a little bit earlier than he casts on your screen, so the projectile location will be a little bit desynced. This happens only if the character casting it has intense latency or spikes just before they do it. So the other obvious option is network object projectile. So optionally we can use the server RPC to cast the spell from the owner, and then we use the server to generate the proper effects on both versions of who we're connected to, so on every version of your player model. And then we also instantiate the projectile from the server and make it a network object, and then we basically sync the position of this projectile from the host's world, like the server's world, or optionally the caster's world, if you want to assign ownership to the projectile. So the pros are the projectile will always remain in accurate positions, even in lag spikes, because as soon as the lag stops, the projectile will kind of snap to where it needs to be if there was any lag in updating it. So the cons are more information is passed across the network constantly this way. So if you have thousands of projectiles being instantiated a second, it's not really a good idea to do this. And also, projectile may appear to stutter in the event of network lag. Now, I know you're probably having thousands a second. That was a bit hyperbolic of me to say, but my point is if you're doing a lot of spells and effects in your game and things of that nature, you may want to consider the localized version. So I use option 1 in Nephilim. I tried out both, and I like this one better, personally. I just found it works, and I've tested the viewpoints from multiple perspectives, and I very, very rarely see any spell desync if you set it up properly. So you can use whatever you want. Both are perfectly valid in my eyes. If someone disagrees, I'd love to hear why. Or if you have experience with one or the other and why you might prefer one, I'd love to hear why. But I've tried out both of these, and I like method 1 more personally myself. So I'm going to go ahead with method 1 in this video. Okay, so here is a preview of the animations we're using in this video if you're taking them from Patreon. Just a throw like this, and a lob. So you can see there's the startup, the loop, and then the end part of it there. So I'm going to drag these in here now. We have them here. So I have main hand and offhand. In the video, I'm going to set up both, but I'm going to preview the main hand animations. So we have the charge, the hold, and then the release. And you'll see there's release full. This is the, if you fully charge it, the animation is a little bit different. So we're not going to worry about that in this video. We're just going to do the charge into the hold and then into the release. So in the future, we'll make it so if you're holding the spellcasting button, you will hold the spell for as long as you're holding the button, or as long as the spell will allow you to. And if you fully charge it, you'll proceed into the release full instead of just the release. So we have here spell, main hand, projectile, 01. I'm just going to sort these in the order that they would be. You could put release and release in full like this, but for now, I'm just going to delete release full and just use these 3. So I'm going to rename these to something that makes sense. Spell, main, fireball, start, charge, and release. And then I'm going to make transitions between all these animations, and the final animation, the release, I will translate back to empty when it is done playing. Make sure you set, if you're using these animations, your exit time to 1 and then transition duration to 0, because there's no need to blend these animations. They blend together perfectly anyway. That's the nature of how they're set up. And then just come back here with the transition like so. Okay, cool. So if you want to set up offhand too, just do the same thing. You can copy them and then just paste them all and just change main to off and search out the animations. We'll do that momentarily. First, let's go over to our test spell. Drop in the animation names here. So main hand animation spell is spell underscore main underscore fire underscore ball underscore start underscore 01. And then offhand, just replace main with off if you're doing the same thing I'm doing. So again, just copy all these states because they're already set up nicely. Paste. Change the main keyword to off, and just swap out the animations. And this is okay, by the way, if you don't need animations that are in 3 separate areas like this, or 3 separate states. I just do it because I find it easier. If you have your own animations and you just have a single animation, that's totally okay too. You can still put all the animation events on the one animation. Don't stress out about it. I like using the separated states because then you can go from a charged state to a non-charged state, and you can go from, say, a full charged or a non-full charged version depending on how long you charge it. But you don't need to do that. And you can find lots of animations for free online. So I'm just going to go over here now, swap in these animations. And we're good. Make a transition back to empty. Okay, let's jump back over to the test spell. Let's override the attempt to cast spell. Now, I'm going to leave the base there even though nothing's there right now. And we're going to say if the player is using the right hand, then we're going to play the right hand animation. Otherwise, they have to be using the left hand, so we're going to play the left hand animation or the offhand animation. So we're going to say player.playeranimator.manager.play target action animation, and we pass the main hand spell animation. We set is performing action to true because this is an action. Now down here, we do the same thing, but replace main with offhand. We're still performing an action, so we leave that there. Right above here now, we can say if the player is performing an action return, we can do all of our checks here, or we could utilize our new can I use this item. So let's do that instead. I'm going to say if we can't use this item, we're going to simply return. And now we can override can I use this item, and we can populate it with all the checks that we need. So let's go ahead and do that. Override, can I use this item? So you can take a look at other actions that you have here to kind of get a good idea what you should put in here. I'm actually going to rename this too because it's more likely can I cast the spell, not necessarily can I use the item. We're not checking for the requirements in this specific part. I guess we could though. But for now, we're just going to check if we can actually cast the spell. We have no stats yet to actually check against on the spell, so we'll start with this for now. So let's go over and make sure this requires a player manager variable on the base class. It's going to give you an error then. Drop it in here and then call it up here under attempt to cast spell. And let's just go down to the list. So if we are performing an action, return. All the common ones, if we're jumping, we want to return. If we're out of stamina, we want to return. And whatever other things you don't want to do while you're casting a spell. Actually, don't forget to say return false. That's my bad because this is returning a bool, so return false. And if it passes all these checks, it will go down to return true. At that point, we can continue with attempting to cast a spell. So I'm going to say if stamina is less than or equal to 0, return false. Okay, cool. Looking good. Let's save that. Now, right above that, I'm going to override the successfully cast spell. I'm going to debug.log casted spell. Alright, and we can call this when we actually get to the final part of the spell or instantiate the release effects. And we can override instantiate warm-up spell effects and instantiate release effects. And we can just throw some debug.logs in there too, just to make sure this is all working as intended. Alright, let's jump back here and let's actually go to instantiate warm-up effects. I accidentally renamed this to warm release effects, so I'm going to change that to release effects. And now back over here, I'm going to save this. I'm going to throw in some debug logs just so we can see when we're running through these. So instantiated effects. And then I'm going to say instantiated projectile. Because in our case of a fireball, this is where it will be. And now let's go to our enums. We still need to do a couple more things. We have to know whether we're casting a sorcery or an incantation. And in Elden Ring, if you cast an incantation, you need a certain weapon class. Much like if you're doing sorceries, you need a certain weapon class, usually a stave. So right below weapon class, I'm going to make a public enum for the spell class. We've only got the two. It's either going to be an incantation or a sorcery. So I'm going to say used for information to cast a spell. That's not too informative. We're going to say used to determine which item, the catalyst, is needed to cast a spell. So we're going to have it be a miracle or a sorcery. Whoops, not a miracle. It's supposed to be an incantation. This is not Dark Souls 3. I still call it Ruined Souls, so it's not surprising. Alright, let's save that. Jump back to spell item, header, spell type, or spell class rather, and then make a public variable of that spell class. Cool. Alright, so we still need to have the actual item action to attempt to cast this, which we don't have right now, and we also need to set up our animation events and a few other things. So let's go over into the scripts and items folder. Let's make a caster weapon. So caster weapon item, and it's not going to have anything special right now. It's just going to not be a melee weapon because we're not backstabbing with this or doing a riposte. So in the future, this will have its own little variable for its casting buff, but for now we can just make this derived from a weapon item and leave it as is. Create asset menu name. Menu name is equal to items, weapons, caster, weapon. Let's create one just so we have one in the game we can actually attach a weapon item action to when we make it next. So I'm going to go into the folders under the data, items, and weapons. I'm going to call this caster weapons, and I'm going to make one. It's going to call it charm. And I'm most likely going to steal an item icon from Nephilim. So caster weapon. The weapon animator can be unarmed. The name can be filled in whatever you want. It's not too important now. Just make sure this works. The class can be fist for now, because it's going to have the same animation set anyway, if you're doing it the way Elden Ring does anyway. And I'm going to leave all the other values default for now. Let's go to weapon actions. So assets, scripts, weapon actions. Let's make cast incantation weapon item action, or just action if you want. Alright, let's erase the start and update functionality and drop in our namespace as is per tradition. I'm going to make this derive from the weapon item action. Whoops. And now we can kind of take a peek at one of our other weapon item actions, and I'm just going to copy the attempt perform action and the other function performing it and just delete everything else that I don't need. So all these checks are cool. This is cool. And now let's change perform light attack into cast incantation. And then from there, we can actually just reference the spell itself from the player's inventory. So if player performing action, we can actually do a couple more checks first though. So if the current spell does not equal spell type incantation, we want to return, and if it's null, we want to return. So let's just put these up here. So if the player inventory's spell is null, return, and also if the spell type, make sure you put this one after the null check, just in case it is null. If the spell type does not equal the incantation, or spell class rather, we also want to return, because you can only cast incantations with a specific object we've made. Now you can make an item action if you want that allows you to cast both. I believe there are items in the Soul series and Elden Ring that allow you to cast either an incantation or a sorcery. So after you pass all those checks, player performing action, player inventory manager, current spell, attempt to cast spell, and we pass the player performing action, and then we are good to go. Let's save that. Okay, cool. Looks good. Let's make sure we can actually create this item action. So we're going to say create asset menu name. Menu name is equal to character actions, weapon actions / incantation action. Save that. Create the weapon action. Put it in your world action manager prefab, and then you can drop that into your charm or whatever you've made to cast your incantation and test this out. So I'm going to go to the world action manager here, drop this in like so, drag and drop. Then I'm going to go over to the charm and drop in the action down here under, we're just going to put all the actions right now as casting actions. Now, in the future, I'll make it so if you're out of your resource, your focus points, you'll do a punch instead. But for now, this is fine. Let's just make sure this works first, and then we can expand on it when the framework is there. So let's go to the player combat manager. And right down below here where we have animation event calls, this is perfect for us. We're going to place a few here. So we're going to make one for public void, successfully cast spell, or if you want to call it instantiate spell, release, and warm up, that's fine too. So we're just going to have instantiate spell warm up effects and instantiate spell release effects. Or you could say attempt to cast spell and successfully cast spell if you prefer those naming conventions. It's entirely up to you. They're both going to do the same thing when they're done. So from there, we need to first check to make sure there is in fact a spell in the player's inventory. Otherwise, we'll get an error. So if the player.playerinventory.current spell is equal to null, simply return. Do the same thing on both of these. And if it is not null, then we're going to do a check, and we're just going to actually call a function from there that we now need to make public, because I believe it is still unprotected. So player.playerinventory.manager.current spell. Let's go over here. Yes, it is. So we need to change instantiate warm-up spell effects from protected to public, and do the same thing on instantiate release effects. Now, make sure you do the same thing on any class that inherits from your spell item class. For me, it's test spell. Otherwise, you're going to get an error. So protected becomes public, and protected becomes public. Now, if you want to separate the release effects from the successfully cast spell effects or functions, you can. If you want to have some flags or some basically information go off when you successfully finish the spell, it's up to you. I'll discuss more on that when we actually get to our live example of the fireball and the fire orb. So whatever makes the most sense to you, kind of set it up that way so the structure makes the most sense to you and is easy to understand. So I'm just going to call these functions here instantiate warm-up and instantiate spell release effects. Okay, save that. Now let's go drop these on some animation FBX files so they actually go off. So here I have main projectile charge. Boom, right there when the hand goes down is where I want to instantiate the warm-up effects. And if you want to add other animation events to this too, like if you want to play different effects before or after, feel free to throw some more in there, obviously. Just the more animation events you add, the more work you're going to have for each of your spells. That's okay. Now put release where it makes sense to have release, and then go over into your world item database and add your charm so you can access it. And make sure you add the spell so you can use it. Now I'm just going to go into the world here, going to click on my player, going to make sure I have my test spell equipped, and yes I do. And then I'm going to attempt to cast the spell by using one of the bumpers. So I do so. You can see here I switch my spear, I play animation, I switch my charm, and I play the spell animation. And there are the two animation events. Cool, working as intended. So this is the framework for how we're going to set up our first spell, which is going to be Fireball. So this is a perfect place to throw it over to you guys, because now you have all the information you need to attempt to do this yourself, and I encourage you to do so. So what you should do with this is make some kind of projectile spell, give the spell projectile its own damage collider, decide how you want to make the projectile move, and make it hurt and affect something in the game. So if you can't figure it out, don't worry, but give it a shot. You will learn a lot that way. When I come back in the next video, I will give a live example, and I'll go through how I would make a fire orb. Thank you for joining me again this weekend. I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, a special thank you to my patrons. It is because of each and every one of you I get to keep doing this, so you have my sincerest gratitude. I'll see you guys next week for Fireball, where we create the first actual spell, but don't forget to attempt this on your own.